What's up, everyone? Welcome to the See-Through Podcast, a podcast that creates transparency on disabilities and the champions with them. As always, I am your host, Lance Johnson, and I live, create, and podcast from Brooklyn, New York, with an eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa, or RP for short. This marks episode 33 of the podcast, and as you may have seen from the title, but this episode marks a significant date for the podcast. It marks the first anniversary or birthday, whichever celebratory word you prefer, of the See-Through Podcast. So, to celebrate, I'm spicing things up this week to essentially toot my own horn about doing this thing for a whole year. But before I begin this special 1-year episode, I'm going to need you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow the podcast on whatever platform you're streaming this on, and definitely follow the podcast on social media. The handle is at See-Through-Pod. I mean, come on. It's been a whole year if you haven't yet. What's with the commitment issues? And if you're new, thanks for checking out this podcast. So, over the past year, I've had some great conversations from guests all around the world. I've had 32 lovely guests, and where they're from has spanned 6 different countries. Also, my podcast has been downloaded in 16 different countries, which makes me feel amazing that my podcast is essentially international. And outside of those 32 people, I've networked and discovered thousands of people in the disability community. So it's needless to say that it's been a solid year, and I'm feeling really, really grateful and excited about what I have going on here. I'm incredibly proud of this podcast, and I've been having a ton of fun making these episodes and getting to know everyone, and I can't wait to keep growing and learning with everyone. I've grown quite a bit during this past year, and while I still have a massive amount to learn, I am just now getting confident behind this mic. When I started, I wasn't nearly as confident in my podcasting skills as I am now. I wasn't sure if I was extroverted enough to want to talk to people at this high of a frequency. I wasn't even sure if I was using the right microphone, the right software. I was constantly worried that my audio wasn't recording during the interviews. Well, I'm still paranoid about that every interview. But, I wasn't sure people would want to spend their valuable and limited time talking to me via a webcam, let alone listen to me talk. But the main thing that I wasn't sure of was whether I'd be accepted by the visually impaired community, and definitely the disability community as a whole. As someone who isn't even considered legally blind, and as someone who still has enough central vision to not use a cane, I was afraid people in the RP community would think that I'm trying to be the voice or face of RP or the visually impaired community as a whole, when that's simply not the case. In actuality, I'm just a content creator and video editor who wanted a new format to be creative and tell stories, which for me right now is podcasting. So long story short, thanks everyone for accepting me into your amazing community and ears. By the way, I guess you could say that I haven't been completely accepted, as I've been denied by a ton of people that I have reached out to because I wanted them to be guests on the podcast. But, that's expected as someone new to the scene. Maybe they'll change their mind down the road. And on episode 25, which features the amazing Becky Andrews, I called myself an RP rookie, and I stand by that. I'm super new to the disability community, and I'm super interested and inspired by everyone I talk to. So with that said, I thought this would be a great chance to reflect on this past year by quickly going through each episode that I've done so far and talk about what I specifically got out of that interview and what I hope the listeners got out of it as well. This is also my way of thanking each guest individually, as every episode has equally helped shape this podcast. And if you're new, this could also be a great chance for you to get caught up with what I'm doing, or maybe learn about an episode that you made the huge mistake of overlooking, and then you'll want to go back and listen to it. And if you want to make the listening experience of this podcast more of a party, then let's play a drinking game. How about every time I say the word RP or retinitis pigmentosa, you have to take a shot. Let's see if you can make it through the episode. I doubt it. And I'm about to go into pretty good detail and cover every episode here. So if you've heard every episode and you feel like you're a master on everything related to the See-Through podcast, and you don't want to hear these descriptions of each episode, even though I think they're entertaining and they're a great recap on this past year, you'll still want to stick around for what I talk about after the episode recaps, as I'm going to cover a lot, and I'm going to get open and I'm going to get real about how I feel about the disability community. I'm also going to cover my future plans for the podcast, so you definitely will not want to skip the rest of this episode. So let's get started. Episode 1, featuring Lance Johnson. What a handsome guy. And oh, what a voice. I want him to talk in my ear via headphones. That's all I have to say about this episode. Episode 2, Alex Blaschek. Alex was my first guest, so she definitely has a sentimental place in my heart for agreeing to do an interview with absolutely no idea of how the episode would turn out. So Alex, I'm super thankful for you for that. And as a filmmaker, this episode was right up my alley as we discussed how Alex and her crew overcame accessibility issues as they traveled to the Shetland Islands to film her documentary, Speaking Nearby. You'll have to listen to the episode to know the full story. Plus, you'll get to hear some audio from the film, and you'll get to hear me stumble my way through my first interview. Episode 3, featuring the Two Blind Brothers. The Two Blind Brothers seem to be celebrities in the visually impaired community, and for good reason. Besides having a super cool clothing company, they have donated over $700,000 of their profits to Foundation Fighting Blindness to help find a cure for various retinal eye diseases. And by the way, I definitely vouch for their clothing. Super soft fabric. But back to this episode, I was so hyped when they agreed to do an interview with me. And I admit, I was definitely a little nervous, I won't lie. And outside the Two Blind Brothers having a big reputation in the visually impaired community, this episode was big for another reason. This was my intro into interviewing the visually impaired community, and was the first episode where I got my first taste of speaking to someone I could relate to when it comes to a vision loss experience, as they both live with Stargardt's disease. And on another side note, they hired me to edit some of their social media content right after this. So if you're thinking of starting a new creative project or any project in general, I'd recommend listening to this episode. Episode 4, Lex Gillette. Lex is my guy. What a nice and down-to-earth man. I mean, he is the most accomplished blind long and triple jumper in the history of U.S. Paralympics. He also is the world record holder in the long jump, a 4-time Paralympic medalist, a 2-time long jump world champion, and a 16-time national champion. I mean, what more do I need to say to get you interested in this episode? And if you don't want to listen to this episode, at the very least, root for him in the upcoming 2021 Paralympics in Tokyo, Japan, coming up this August. Lex, you have this. Bring home the gold. Episode 5, Christy Lee. Christy was my genetics counselor when I lived in North Carolina. Christy is the person who made genetic testing happen for me and my family, so I owe her a ton. If you didn't know, genetic testing is the reason I know what strain of RP I have. It's also how I know how likely it is for me to pass on RP to my future kids. So with that said, this episode is a great intro into what genetics counselors do, but also into what genetic testing entails and the knowledge it can bring. This episode is a great intro into what genetics counselors do, as well as what genetic testing is. Episode 6, Kate Connor. Kate really came through for me on this episode. This episode is the most streamed episode so far, which, doesn't surprise me at all. And while we touched on some heavy topics, this episode was a fun one to produce because Kate is an old coworker of mine from my ad agency days in North Carolina. I've always admired the creative flair Kate would add to anything she touched when we worked together, and I knew going into this interview that Kate was going to crush it and she was going to be a great guest. And you know what? I was right. She delivered. And besides having a way with words and a heart of gold, Kate presented a very unique perspective to the podcast. She spoke from the POV of a mother who is raising her blind daughter, Madeleine. Madeleine is also a leukemia survivor. So there are a lot of layers to this episode. This episode is a must listen, especially since the next episode features Kate's daughter herself, Madeleine Connor. Episode 7, Madeleine Connor. Out of respect to all of my guests, I have to say that each episode is my favorite episode in some way or another. But you know what? Madeleine's episode is my real favorite. Sorry, everyone else. This episode is my personal favorite episode as it was so much fun interviewing Madeleine. At age 13, Madeleine is the youngest guest I've talked to, but she has overcome so much for her age. Madeleine was born blind. She has beat leukemia, yet her outlook is still super positive and creative and youthful. Madeleine, I am so inspired by you. Episode 8, featuring Angel Adorno. Angel is quite the character, but, in a good way. Besides stand-up comedy, Angel is a badass as he practices Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as someone who is blind. And you know what? Angel pretty much talked me into starting Jiu-Jitsu. So maybe one day I'll roll with Angel, as he called it. Maybe we'll film it and charge people for it pay-per-view style. Who's in? Episode 9, featuring Katarina Wyckoff. Katarina is another guest that is dear to me, as she is a podcast host herself. In fact, I was introduced to Katarina when she asked me to come on her own podcast, Freewheelin' with Katarina. But Katarina definitely makes a better guest than I do, so you'll want to check this episode out. Katarina and I talk about a bunch of cool shit. We talk about how she finds independence as a wheelchair user, her solo travels through Europe, how she piggybacked the Appalachian Trail, and more. And yep, you heard that right. Episode 10, featuring Victor Mifsud. Victor, otherwise known as the blind biohacker, is now someone I would consider a good friend of mine. After interviewing him, it didn't take that long for me to realize that we had, similar vibes, interests, and energy. And outside of that, this episode was big for the podcast because Victor was my first guest to share the same eye disease as me, which is retinitis pigmentosa. In this episode, we dive deep into Victor's feature-length documentary called My Neuroplastic Adventure, and we breach the surface of how Victor is biohacking his vision from both the inside and outside. Episode 11, Mary Mamelidi. Mary is another guest of mine that is a podcaster. And Mary's podcast, Kitchen Confession, is definitely a podcast you should check out if you consider yourself a foodie. Plus, I was also a guest on her podcast as well, so go check out my episode. Mary is an on-air food expert who also has RP, like myself. We talk about her life as a legally blind cook and coming out or self-identifying as someone with a visual impairment, which is a topic I love exploring. Episode 12, Niha Aurora. What an amazing woman Niha is. Niha is based in New Delhi, India, and is the founder of Planet Abled, the only organization in the world that mixes people of all disabilities together into one group to travel together. The fact that she's mixing disabilities together definitely matches the vibe of this podcast. So if you're into travel, this episode is for you. Episode 13, Connor McCauley. Connor is a young lad from Dublin, Ireland, who is wise beyond his years. In this episode, Connor discusses his personal process of obtaining and maintaining a positive mindset while living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I see a really bright future for Connor, so he should definitely be on your radar. Episode 14, Dan Mancina. Dan the man. Hey, that's what he goes by. But yeah, I agree with it. Dan is the man, and Dan's episode is easily the most chill and laid back episode I'll probably ever put out. And outside of being super chill, Dan is a highly skilled skateboarder who still shreds despite becoming blind due to retinitis pigmentosa. In this episode, we share RP stories, we talk about vision rehabilitation therapy, and of course, we talk about his adaptive way of skateboarding. Episode 15, Noah Mbuyamba. Imagine losing your lower right leg while motorbiking on vacation. That's exactly what happened to Noah. And to overcome that, Noah is crushing it as a para-athlete and seeks to become the next Blade Runner. So if you're into sports, you're into fitness, this episode is right up your alley because Noah and I talk about his mindset, his diet, and his training regimen. Episode 16, Taylor Kane. Taylor is a force to be reckoned with, as Taylor is not only the founder and president of Remember the Girls, an international nonprofit that unites, educates, and empowers female carriers of X-linked genetic disorders, but she is also an author, public speaker, and disability rights activist. Taylor herself pushed the state of New Jersey to create a law that requires the screening of newborns for ALD or adrenoleukodystrophy, which is the X-linked disease Taylor is a carrier of. Episode 17, Andy Bolen. Andy, what a friendly and smart guy. Andy is the Associate Director of Patient and Medical Community Engagement at Procure Therapeutics. Based in the Netherlands, Procure is a biotechnology company dedicated to changing lives by developing RNA therapies for rare genetic disorders, one of them being RP. So, obviously I'm a supporter. In this episode, we get scientific and go over the science behind their therapies and how important genetic testing is for people with an inherited retinal disease. And don't worry, this episode does not go over your head as we go through great lengths to explain it in an easy way to understand. And if you liked episode 5 with Christy Lee, my genetics counselor, then you'll definitely love this episode. Episode 18, Jermaine Greaves. Outside of creating viral dance videos, Jermaine is the co-founder of the social movement Black Disabled Lives Matter. In this episode, Jermaine and I dive deep into the Black Disabled Lives Matter mission, his disability, cerebral palsy, and how to own who you are as a disabled person and how to be the most authentic version of yourself. Jermaine is a super sweet guy who is doing an amazing job of promoting positivity within the disability community. And if you want to learn more about Jermaine, give this episode a listen. Episode 19, featuring Casey Acree. What an absolute beast in the gym Casey is. Seriously, go check out his Instagram and see it for yourself. His handle is at Coach Casey Acree. Casey is a health and fitness coach and adaptive CrossFit champion. Born without part of his left arm, Casey is a congenital amputee, but he seriously still kills it in the gym, and his mindset of being adaptive and working hard is the key to his success. So if you're looking to get inspired to help reach your fitness goals or any goals in general, this episode is for you. Episode 20, featuring my friend, John Marin. John is my New York City neighbor as he lives up in the Bronx. John is the program director for the Career Discovery Project, a year-round internship program that connects blind and visually impaired high school and college students with career-based work opportunities. John and I talk about the current job climate for people with vision impairments, and outside of his job, but also related to his job, John also just released his first book titled See Us, which is a photographic journey of 6 visually impaired young adults from New York City that are balancing their lives between work, home, and school. This episode covers a ton of topics, and John is such a caring guy that I think everyone should know who he is. And if you want to check out John's book, See Us, just visit IamJohnMarin.com. Episode 21, Pete Dankelson. You may know him online as Pete's Diary. And if you don't, I highly recommend you follow Pete's account, which again is Pete's.diary. Pete absolutely shreds on guitar. And did I mention he's only 20 years old? Born with Goldenhar syndrome, Pete has overcame a lot in his life already, and he uses that knowledge and wisdom to spread positivity and self-acceptance through his music and public speaking. As a guitar player myself, this episode was a lot of fun as I got to nerd out a bit with Pete and talk about various guitar gear, his playing techniques, and even some of our favorite guitarists. So if you're a guitar player or even musician, you'll definitely love this episode. Episode 22, featuring Katarina Rivera. Katarina is the ultimate stigma smasher, which is a phrase she coined and is using with her brand Blindish Latina. The Blindish Latina name is inspired by her disability, which is Usher syndrome, a syndrome that pairs my vision impairment, retinitis pigmentosa, or RP, with hearing loss. So we go deep into her personal story and the messaging of acceptance when it comes to disabilities, as well as her goals as a disability advocate and entrepreneur. Katarina is going to do massive things for the disability community, and I am so happy to be her ally because she gets shit done. So go check out Katarina's work. It's very personal, yet educational. Her social handle is at Blindish Latina. Episode 23, featuring Tyler and Emma Millard. Tyler and Emma, also known as the Ghost of Liberty, which is their band, brought a very unique perspective to this podcast due to Tyler and Emma are not only a married couple, but they write and perform music together. And as someone who was recently married, I loved hearing their individual perspectives on being in an interabled relationship. Plus, Tyler's sense of humor had me laughing throughout this episode. This episode is truly a gem, just like Tyler and Emma. Episode 24, featuring Victor Mifsud. The blind biohacker himself is back again. Victor is the first guest to return to the podcast, and this time around, it felt like talking to a buddy of mine. And in this episode, we cover a variety of topics that we didn't get to cover on the first time around. These topics include Victor's biohacking routine, as well as Victor's upcoming Vision Optimization Summit that he is the founder of. The Vision Optimization Summit is a virtual summit where you'll hear from the world's leaders on naturally reversing vision loss, red light therapy, trauma, psychedelics, circadian biology, and much more. And if any of that sounds up your alley, you could still sign up for the summit. Just visit visionoptimizationsummit.com. Episode 25, featuring Becky Andrews. Becky is what I call an RP veteran. Becky has accomplished a ton, and she just beams positivity and good energy. And that makes sense because Becky is a licensed clinical mental health counselor who is the owner of 2 counseling businesses, with one of them being a nonprofit. Becky is also a marathon runner, tandem bike rider, guide dog owner, and author. So she is definitely well-rounded. In this episode, I opened up a bit about my own personal mental health when it comes to living with RP. So in this episode, I was definitely being transparent. And I kind of feel like I got a little bit of a free therapy session out of this episode. Episode 26, featuring Brian Switzer. Brian, what a solid guy who I really hit it off with right out of the gate. Brian is a deafblind educator and athlete living with Usher syndrome. Brian is the assistive tech instructor for Career Launch at the Perkins School for the Blind and is a marathon runner who has run marathons everywhere, including the Equinox Marathon in Alaska, which is widely considered one of the most difficult marathons in the nation. I mean, runners face an 1,800-foot ascent race through uneven terrain in the snow, freezing temperatures. But that's just one small detail and part of Brian's amazing story. Episode 27, Michael Tubiak and Steve Johnson. Mike and Steve are my dudes. They run a great YouTube channel called The RP Show, where each episode of their show covers different topics that relate to life with RP. Honestly, if you have RP or any visual impairment, I think you'll likely relate to the content they're making. Also, their sense of humor will have you laughing out loud. On that note, this episode is basically 3 guys just broing it up and sharing relatable stories. This episode is another one of my personal favorites, and I plan for Mike and Steve to be regulars on this podcast. So I'd advise you to go ahead and familiarize yourself with Mike and Steve. Episode 28, featuring Tom Forsyth and Laura McLean. Tom and Laura are the inventors and creators of the Ramble Tag, which is a contactless guidance aid for the visually impaired that you can wear on your arm. This product is a game changer for guidance aids, so definitely check out rambletag.co.uk if you're interested in having another guidance aid in your toolbox. Interviewing Laura and Tom was a trip because 1, I loved their Scottish accents. 2, Tom was a bit of a comedian and joker. Long story short, I know why the word ramble is in the name of their product, and I mean that in the best way possible. Episode 29, Virginia Rose. Virginia is the founder and president of Birdability, a nonprofit that works to ensure birding and the outdoors are welcoming, inclusive, safe, and accessible for everybody. And besides loving what Birdability does, Virginia and I instantly hit it off as she easily accessed my inner nerd as we dove deep into birding culture and her life as a wheelchair user. I aspire to be more like Virginia, and I think everyone who listens to this episode will as well. Next episode 30, featuring Carrie Jester. Carrie Jester. That name sounds familiar. Oh yeah, she's my sister. Carrie's episode was as personal as it can get. And while my sister also has RP, this episode is about grieving the loss of a child. In this case, my nephew and her son, Easton Wyatt Jester. Easton was only with our family for one day, but he is still a huge part of our story. And in this episode, Carrie bravely walks listeners through her experience of her pregnancy and birth of Easton and the mental health challenges she has faced and is still facing. This is definitely a heavy episode. It's super raw and real, but it will likely force you to think of your current life in a different light. So I would advise all of my listeners to check this episode out. I also think it does a great job to help explain a little bit of where I'm coming from and my perspective on life. Episode 31, Kate Elam. Kate is the founder of RP Hope, a nonprofit organization that serves to educate both the public and RP patients on my eye disease, retinitis pigmentosa, or RP for short. Kate is 18 years old, so she not only brought a younger perspective to living with RP, but she also is newly diagnosed and is at the beginning of her RP journey, which is similar to me. So we had a lot to talk about and relate to during our conversation. If you're someone living with RP, RP Hope should definitely be on your radar. Go give them a look up online. Their website is rphope.org. And the last episode before hitting the year marker is episode 32, featuring Andrew Donald from Melbourne, Australia. Andy goes by the name Nocturnal Archer because he is a blind archer and bow hunter living with rod monochromatism, an eye disease that basically has the exact opposite symptoms of my eye disease, RP. For example, rod monochromatism causes day blindness instead of night blindness. His central vision is impacted versus his peripheral. And something that's just different for me altogether, with rod monochromatism, you can't see color. So you see in black and white, which I find really fascinating. Anyways, while his disability is interesting, Andy himself is way more interesting as he is an outdoorsman and a man of many trades. Seriously, the man does everything. He's the kind of guy you'd want to have around during a zombie apocalypse type of situation. He's the guy that will keep you alive. So I would definitely follow Andy online. His Instagram is Nocturnal Archer. And that's just a tad bit about each episode. I couldn't go into deep detail there, or this episode would be like 10 hours long. And, maybe those descriptions will entice you to check out an episode you haven't listened to yet. Or maybe I did the opposite and you're not interested in the podcast anymore. I hope not. And to any of my podcast guests that are currently listening, thank you so much for not only agreeing to come on, but being an active listener as well. I've really enjoyed getting to know you better and it's amazing what I learned about you from just an hour of talking. And, Google helps too. Can't leave that out. And on a different side of things, I'm going to move into something different here. I want to talk about how my mindset has changed over the past year. And after going through each episode and deeply thinking about this past year, I'm finally able to have enough data to pick up on some common themes and overlaps of topics that each individual episode seems to touch on. And while I want the vibe of this podcast to be entertaining, positive, and inspiring, I also want to secretly educate while being all those things. So with that said, it's wild to think about how much my perception of the disability community has shifted since I started this thing. For example, and this is sad to admit, but I had never heard of the word ableism before starting this podcast. Ableism, for those who don't know, is defined as the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities or people who are perceived to be disabled. So ableist people are basically people who view the disabled as inferior to the non-disabled. And while I didn't know the word, I did know that this way of thinking existed. In fact, I'll admit, I have some ableist views myself. I mean, why else did I hide my disability growing up? Because I didn't want to be perceived differently or be viewed as less than. In fact, I didn't want to perceive my own self differently and was living in denial. And to be honest, growing up, I imagined all visually impaired people or people who are blind were living miserable lives that were heavily dependent on others. And I know now that that's completely wrong. And I admit I was very ignorant with that viewpoint. But my point is, I had some ableist views, and I still have some ableist views embedded deep in me. And this podcast has definitely helped shake some of those out. But at the same time, it's still an ongoing process, to be honest. In fact, I think we all have some ableism ingrained deep within us. But if I want to take that thought a little further, I have to admit, yes, I'm visually impaired, but I'm not legally blind and I don't use a cane, so my disability is considered an invisible disability. So I haven't had to deal with ableism in the same sense some of my other guests have had to. So I have lived a very privileged life when it comes to this, and I understand that and admit that completely. I just wanted to put that out there. And with that said, I do expect to exponentially experience ableism more and more as I age. I just bought my first white cane, so whenever that's brought out on the regular, I'm sure I'll have more firsthand stories to tell on this topic. And while my podcast by no means is trying to throw the victim card out there, in fact, I think my podcast does the opposite. But when it comes to what my listeners take away from the stories they hear on the podcast, I would like to think that I'm educating everyone on issues that the disability community faces just by simply presenting real conversations with real people about real things and real thoughts we all have. And if you don't have a disabled friend, which is highly unlikely, by the way, then my podcast may be your window into understanding the disabled a little more and will essentially help you get in someone else's head for a bit. And all right, here's a big one. And this may come as a surprise to some of you, but I don't consider myself an activist. And you might be saying, how so? You have a podcast about disabilities, and social justice is a major topic that's kind of unavoidable these days. So I want to explain myself. Here's where I'm coming from. And you may have already picked up on this if you're an avid listener, but I avoid pushing politics on the podcast. I avoid pushing politics for the simple reason that I'm not trying to push an agenda that's not my own. I'm simply trying to tell stories in an entertaining and educational way, and if it empowers or inspires you, then that's even better. I have this approach because the world may be heavily divided, but I think if you only talk to people who already agree with you, then you're not really going to change much. I think if you want to be a game changer in the disability community, or just in general, then you should try to reach as wide of an audience as possible and not exclude what could be a major part of your listenership. For this reason, I don't push religious ideology on the podcast as well. So long story short, I try to make both my guests and listeners comfortable, and I try to have a very diverse listenership and guest list, as I want to cultivate independent thinking, and I want my listeners to form their own opinions versus absorb a specific viewpoint that I could push on people. But with that said, I can't deny that I'm using my platform to spread specific messages. And out of all the messages that I'm sending, equality is the main one. I mean, everyone should want equality, right? It seems like a basic human necessity, and it's essential to any successful culture. And in my opinion, equality to the disability community means a variety of things, but I'm going to boil them down to two. One of them being accessibility, as accessibility is constantly brought up on the podcast. And what I mean by accessibility, I mean it in two ways. Accessibility in both physical and digital spaces. Our spaces and infrastructures built for the disabled to explore them, how available is public transit, our buildings and restrooms accessible for wheelchair users, our websites and digital media friendly to the visually impaired or hard of hearing. And these are just a few examples. That list could go on and on and on. And after a lot of deep thought, I've kind of came to the conclusion that most people only notice accessibility issues when it's something that they personally have to deal with, even though being disabled can be non-linear and anyone can become disabled at any moment. So my hope with this podcast is to present these issues in an entertaining and digestible way to educate the public on a variety of accessibility issues and how they relate to specific disabilities. Another aspect of equality that I want to touch on is equal perception of worth. And what I mean by that is that society needs a change in their general perception of the disability community. We need to present the disability community to the public eye more and change the false narrative of being less valuable or productive. And to do that, we need more disabled public figures and artists seen in pop culture, movies, the music industry, politics, etc., you name it. So to help do that, I try to bring a variety of guests on the podcast to help catapult some fresh faces into the public eye. And as an independent podcast producer, I don't have a supervisor, I don't have a boss, I don't have an assistant. It's literally just me doing this podcast. So I am the gatekeeper of what I talk about and who I talk to on this podcast. Every decision comes down to me. So I may have some controversial guests on here and there, but just know with anyone I bring on, I put a great amount of thought on whether or not they're a good fit for the podcast. And for the people I do bring on, I bring them on so they can present a fresh perspective to the podcast. And sometimes I may disagree with my guest. And if I do, I'll just respectfully let them know. But I try to be as open-minded as possible. I think it's the documentary filmmaker in me. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight as to what I look for in both my guests and topics. Sorry if you feel like I was just preaching to you, but I haven't really had a chance to talk about my personal perspective on running this podcast, why I do it, what I think about the disability community, what I think about accessibility, and a lot of different things. And if you're investing in this podcast, then you're kind of investing in me. In every episode, I talk about being transparent. So that's all I'm trying to be. Plus, every episode, I ask everyone to reach out if they think they would make a good guest or know someone who would make a good guest. So maybe this episode will help you know exactly what I'm looking for. But all right, let me get off my soapbox. Let's talk about something way more chill and fun. The last thing that I want to bring up in this episode is definitely the best part of this episode, honestly. So I guess I'm doing the whole save the best for last thing here. How original, right? But the last thing I want to talk about is the future of this podcast. I have some massive plans for this podcast, and I'm going all in on this thing. For the past year, I've been investing a ton of my time, money, and self into this podcast. And as someone who has been working professionally in the creative industry for the past 10 years, I can easily say that this podcast has been the most rewarding project I've ever worked on. So I want to keep riding this wave for as long as I can and as long as it makes sense. I won't go into every little detail here until more things are ironed out, but here's a list of what I plan to bring to everyone in the near future. For starters, I want to provide videos of my episodes. So basically video that will accompany the standard audio episode. I think this will help me boost my YouTube channel. I'm looking to produce a lot more video content in general. Plus, I know you all are dying to see more of my face. So to do this, I'm in the process of nailing down what gear I need to buy to pull this off. I'm trying to think about what my video background's going to be and a ton of different things. But once I have that figured out, expect visuals to accompany the audio for each episode. Next on the list, and this is a super big one, but I plan to start a Patreon account where you'll be able to pay a little bit of money each month to get access to bonus episodes, exclusive merch, the chance to know my guests ahead of time, and a chance to submit questions for me to ask those guests during the episode as part of a new fan Q&A section that I want to add to each episode. And speaking of merch, I'd love to see people wearing a slick see-through podcast shirt, hoodie, hat, tank top with the podcast logo on it. So keep an eye out for a merch drop sometime in the near future. I'm very particular about clothing, so I'm trying to take my time with this merch drop as I want my merchandise to actually be clothes that you would want to wear on the regular. So I'm glad I put those things out there. That's all I'll share for now. I have a few other ideas cooking up, but I'll save those for another time. And if any of the above excites you, please don't be afraid. Let me know what you're hype about. But I think that does it for this episode. And man, doing an episode by yourself is tough. I definitely need a guest to help keep everyone's attention. So if you made it this far, wow, thanks so much for listening. I owe you everything. And again, I want to thank every single person who listens. It truly means the world to me. I have so much fun producing these episodes. But honestly, at the end of the day, I take providing valuable content very seriously. And I want to give everyone who listens the best possible podcast to listen to. So if you're a fan, I'd love to hear from you and know your take on the podcast. If you want to contact me, you can DM me on social media. The handle is @seethroughpod. Or you can email me at theseethroughpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can rate the podcast and leave a review on whichever streaming platform you listen on. And on that note, you can find everything you need to know about the podcast by visiting the website seethroughpod.com. On the website, you can access all the episodes, all my social media accounts, and all the press I did for this past year. It's a one-stop shop for everything. And again, seriously, thanks for listening and letting me be transparent with you. I really hope you stick around for many more years to come. So on that note, let's cheers for the next year of the See-Through podcast. And you know the drill. Until next episode, stay transparent, everyone.